Hey everyone, this is Ryan and Greg with another Legion breakdown. This is Season 3, Episode 3, Chapter 22.
Now, before we get started, again, spoiler warning, if you haven't watched this episode yet, get out of here, go watch it, then come on back. Alright, let's get started. So, wow. This one bored me completely. I'm sorry.
Completely boring. Listen, what am I watching?
I'm kidding. No, I loved it.
Actually, it was one of the most fun Legion episodes because of all the deep comic book references. We finally got to see the universe kind of get closer to the comic books from what we've seen before.
Just a little bit. At least in Noah Hawley's universe for the show.
Exactly.
It's creeping into the comics a little bit more, and I dug it.
And of course, we're talking about Charles Xavier and Gabrielle Haller, David Haller's parents. We got some backstory and context into how they first met, into how the Shadow King, first infected David Haller and all that kind of stuff. So overall, an incredible episode of TV, especially if you are familiar with the comic books.
How long have you been gone? Days? Weeks?
All right, let's talk about the overall construction of the episode. So we're dealing with flashbacks, right? We know David and Switch are time traveling, and this kind of takes over a Christmas Carol type construction of what we're seeing, right? They're kind of on the outside watching in of these flashbacks of David's parents, but those flashbacks take over a course of, I would say, a decade of them kind of meeting each other and then starting a family.
It takes time for you to go through them, because at first you're thinking, okay, what's going on here? Is it really, what's the order for this? And then you realize, okay, it's all coming from Switch and David's perspective, as you find out towards the end of the episode, and I loved the way they set that up.
Totally, and I think it was really effective in kind of creating a very dreamlike experience, which we've come as accustomed with Legion. You know, you can't tell what is kind of real and what is fake, and what is maybe inside of Gabrielle Haller's mind, and what kind of maybe Charles Xavier has constructed as well. So it does a good job jumping throughout the timelines and creating a really strong sense of a dream almost.
It gave me one of those who's the dreamer moments, just like, again, sorry, I'm gonna say this a lot, probably Twin Peaks. Just the way they're going through this, it makes you wonder whether or not, is this all from Charles' perspective the entire time, or is it really from David's? There are moments where you're wondering who's the dreamer, especially that gorgeous shot we're gonna talk about later with the door outside and just Gabrielle's just waiting and you get a touch, and they don't really go back to that at all, and I love that.
Remind me. How long have you been gone?
Like we said, it was really cool to get some backstory and some context into how David's parents cared for him in the beginning, right? Yeah. We get a lot of callbacks to certain lines, like when Gabrielle says, "My beautiful boy." We've heard Farouk say this a few times. We hear it at the end of this episode as well. It really makes you think about, initially Farouk, infiltrated the family and took over control of David, and those for reasons that, for revenge on Professor X.
Yeah.
But, he says time and time again that he has love for him as well.
Yes, he does. He does love him after all this time being with him and being in this journey, I guess we'll call it, for 30 plus years. Right. Even though, remember, he hitched a ride on a child here, we're talking about, and stayed with him for the entire time without his consent.
Right. So initially you'd think, okay, this is
a theme going on here.
This is a bad guy. He's a monster. He's a bad guy. He took advantage of this poor child. But maybe after X amount of years that you're with somebody, sorry about that, that you're with somebody, maybe there is a shared trauma, a shared journey, as you said, that now he does have this sense of a paternal feeling towards David.
Do you believe Shadow King is a different person now?
I would like to believe, but I also do feel that he's playing Division 3 for fools, that he has ulterior motives. I think that what we find out that he lost in the astral plane to Professor X, I think that he wants to get back at him by any means necessary.
I think this is a long con for Shadow King. I just, this episode alone really puts the idea firmly back in our heads that Shadow King, he is not a good person. And this one brought us back to what I also love about this show is the horror element and just that creepy, dark tone. And they brought it back really hard in this episode, especially in the colors. We'll talk about that later too.
I have to go. I am coming back.
Now for you comic book fans out there, this is going to be very similar to Uncanny X-Men 117 with the Shadow King and his first meet with Xavier, his first showdown with him.
Right, a few differences from the comic books to the TV show.
Not exactly the same.
But it's basically pulled from the pages, it's that he left to go...
to Morocco.
To Morocco. Well, in the show he's in Morocco. In the comic book, I believe he's in Cairo, Egypt, and he runs into the Shadow King, Storm, a baby Storm, that's correct, and then runs into the Shadow King in a restaurant. I loved how you get images of that very closely match the pages of the comic book. It was really cool to see that come to life in the TV show.
Farouk's outfit, too,
exactly. Yeah,
is pretty damn good.
Yeah. Now, two really significant things that came out of this issue in the comics is that, one, this was the first time that he came face to face with a bad guy, so to speak. One, a mutant that had these powers like him, but used it in the other way.
Yes.
And then two, he actually started the formation of the X-Men. That he wanted to have mutants that he could teach, that he could integrate into society instead of kind of...
So they don't become the Shadow King and take over a little baby.
Right.
My beautiful boy.
The other cool thing about this is exactly what we saw on the chalkboard in season 1, towards the end.
Right, that little explainer video, that really cool explainer portion of the chalkboard.
My dad did all this. Yeah.
This is basically, we're seeing the fight unfold in more context into how it all came about.
Now, with that said, also, I think we're getting the fight, too, later on this season.
I hope so.
We're going to see the fight.
Because we only saw flashes of this. We can assume, later on in the episode, we find out he came back safely. A little too late, obviously, but that, he ran into him, and it wasn't all like, hey, man, nice to see you. I'm another mutant, too. And it was a little bit more of a battle.
I can't wait to see this, and I still know there's going to be some dance numbers in this. I'm just trying to see what's it going to be, West Side Story, or where are we going with this one?
Now, one thing I loved about this episode, as we're time traveling to different parts in their timeline, is that it felt very much like a horror film when Gabrielle is alone at home. Remember, Charles Xavier kind of abandons her at that time, and she, I didn't feel that she was ever completely felt safe. She's a very fragile human being in that mansion that they moved into.
Yes, and this could be a little confusing to people trying to figure out what's going on and why it's so crazy for her right now, because at this point in the story, even though we're still towards the beginning, the Shadow King and Xavier have already met, and they've probably already had their battle.
Right.
And Xavier's trying to get his way back home at this point, and this is why we see all of this horror elements coming into the house as the Shadow King is starting to take over slowly, but he's starting to do that. We don't know how long they're going there. It's just weeks or days.
Right, totally. It's like almost like a race to get home, who gets there first.
Yes.
Now another element that I found interesting is that it kind of reminded me of elements of Game of Thrones. I know that's crazy to say, but the Three-Eyed Raven and Bran Stark kind of traveling back in time, different moments, and
that's a good way to explain
the characters kind of hearing the whispers. So it's like David Haller traveling kind of added to his mother going a bit mad and hearing the whispers in this house. It's kind of ironic that Charles Xavier brought her home and saved her from the mental hospital, and then brought her into a home that was almost haunted with David traveling back to see her and save her. So it's like,
my interpretation of that was that David and Switch, every scene we see with Gabrielle, they are there. They are watching in the background.
Right.
I believe they're there for every single scene we're seeing of this, everything we get with
whether
Charles.
We hear them or they're silent.
Yes,
they're
I
watching.
still think that's them going back in time and they're
Right.
observing everything we see.
Right.
I'm not sure if this is all just the filmmakers giving us flashbacks as well as peppering in shots with David and Switch. I think that's a little too much. I feel like everything's got to come from someone.
I agree with you, but I do think that she is normally, David. There's a moment where David's like, "Why doesn't she see us? Why doesn't she see us?" But there is a moment where she reacts to kind of the whispers in the house.
Like, she hears it. She hears something.
She hears something, and it almost made me feel that like, oh, okay, David unfortunately played a part in his mother going mad, and played a part in himself, the Shadow King successfully getting into him. Not only that, Charles Xavier played a part by abandoning his family in the fragile state that they already were.
Or at least he wasn't going to change anything.
Right.
He couldn't change time this time or any time going back, depending on how many times they're going to try this. I'm assuming they're going to try this one more time.
Yeah.
But with that said, I don't think they're going to be able to stop the Shadow King from taking over David.
I'm right here. You're David. I'm here. I don't understand. Why can't she see me?
Okay, let's go back to my favorite shot of the episode. It's the doors outside, yes. Now, that shot, what do you think is going on? Is this Shadow King or is this Charles Xavier? I think it's Shadow King. I think this is Enter the Shadow King.
I do like your theory on this. I initially thought it was a fabrication of Charles Xavier, him creating something in her mind to keep her safe, to keep outside forces from entering in. And that in his absence, she takes things into her own hands and then is no longer safe when she opens the door. So that almost was like a protection for her in her own mind, and kind of he wanted to put up almost like a concrete barrier from anything else from entering in.
Again, this is why I love this show, because they just put a damn door in the middle of nowhere and we're arguing about whether or not it's a dream or not, because it could possibly not be a dream either.
Only when you're not dealing with mutants that can create stuff make you see things.
So you're dealing with the 3 most powerful mutants when it comes to telepathy.
Right.
Next to Jean Grey, who's not there yet. You're dealing with the Shadow King, Xavier, who we saw his powers exerted in this episode as well.
Yeah.
And then also David, who's trying here, who looks like he's like the odd man out at the moment.
I think you and I both agree that it's not David or Switch doing anything to their environment. That basically it's either Charles or, as you think, it's the Shadow King. It's kind of how he infiltrates the house.
I think this is the beginning of the Shadow King. He's in the house and he's screwing around with them. Why he chose David over Gabrielle, though? Next up, now there are 2 things in this scene with Gabrielle reading a book to David.
Yeah.
First of all, let's start with the little toy, the little doll that's in that
bed. Angry boy.
The angry boy's there. So is this the origin of the angry boy?
Yeah, it's interesting to see like the small little mementos that she kind of left with David, the little, his little doll, end up
creepy.
eventually haunting him his entire life and traumatizing him because of the Shadow King's influence on him, I guess. But years later, that's what he has visions of, chasing him down. And it's cool to kind of see again the context and the background of the origin of how that came to be.
And speaking of that doll, this isn't the first time. So when I say origin, I feel like the origin is when Charles opened up that box in the hospital, and we got that creepy ass scene of her just staring right at. I loved it.
Yeah.
So is this a doll that she had with her at the camps? That's another thing.
I believe so. I think as either a sibling of hers, family member, someone had that for years. A family heirloom that she went through this traumatic experience with, and that's kind of all she had to her name. And then she wanted to pass it down to her son, obviously. And then just years later, it becomes a symbol of torture in him.
And number 2, the book that Gabrielle's reading David is Harold and the Purple Crayon by Crockett Johnson. So, hey.
Like a total fitting children's book for Legion, for
the
David
most
Haller,
fitting book.
Who can create his own worlds. The whole thing is about Harold creating his own world with the crayon, going around. And it's literally what David does, his powers are able to do.
True, but I feel like this was for Charles. This was representing Charles Xavier, because also while she's reading the book, what's going on? We get the first, I'm assuming, Mach 1 for Cerebro.
Right.
That scene's playing over the fact that she's reading this book. I feel like this whole episode is just elements and themes for Charles Xavier more than anything, not David. We're getting a origin story, love story, backstory, tragic love story for Charles Xavier and Gabrielle. And David is just he's in the background trying to find his way into this story somehow. He's knocking on the doors and he can't get in.
And the tragic thing about it is that this love story, the fallout is that it ruined this boy's life forever. It might have ended the world.
This is terrifying, but I love this show.
Terrifying. You brought up Cerebro, and that was kind of the first time that he could sense that another mutant was out there.
Oh no!
And the reason why we know that the Shadow King is evil as hell.
What color? What
is
color
because
was
we
going
saw
on?
that red all over Charles in the room that he was in as well, when he kind of senses someone else's powers out there. So we know Shadow King is not a good guy.
speaking of the color red, this season, honestly, I know they've done it a lot in seasons past too, especially season 1, but this season really, color is another character.
Yeah.
And just pointing out all the scenes with Charles when they're at the hospital and it's just white, just gone. Everything's void of colors and just pure, or you want to say just creepy the way they pulled that off.
Yeah.
And then for here we just got our normal green means good. So who was wearing green the entire time? Gabrielle. Yep. And on top of that, we have Charles, who's just in the background with his white. But then if you look close, you can see a little bit of blue in there too. Yep. There's no more words to say about when it comes to the color for this show, but I mean, come on.
Perhaps move him to 3. Oh, forget it. Useless lad.
Now let's talk about the mental hospital. Now, for you comic book readers out there, Uncanny X-Men number 161 would be an awesome resource to kind of go back and read, because not only did we get, the initial showdown between Farouk and Professor X from the other issue, but now we get to see kind of how Charles met Gabrielle Haller in the mental institution. Basically, after World War II, these were the hospitals for survivors of the Holocaust. And in this case, in the show at least, Charles Xavier, it seemed like he self-admits himself or is picked up and brought in there because he believes he needs help as well.
He's on some kind of sabbatical maybe with himself after the war, and we see that earlier, so he is dealing with a little bit of a PTSD situation as we saw with using his powers.
Yeah, he had to use his powers against an enemy combatant, and then we see him, a little while later in the mental institute. In the mental hospital. But in the books, it's different. He goes there to kind of help his friend who's working in one of the mental hospitals, and then learns about Gabrielle Haller and has to basically try to help her out and fix her. She's like in a catatonic state after everything that she's been through.
Like you see in this episode?
Totally, like you see in this episode, and he's the one that kind of has to break through her mind and help her get out of it.
That woman there, do you know where she came from?
The camps.
Any family?
No one. Poor thing.
Thank you.
Now, some cool things to point out when we first see Charles in the hospital. There's a little bus.
On the table when he's talking to the doctor. Yes,
and he's bald. I'm straight up. That's
it looked like
the
Professor X that we know. Yes, totally.
And on top of that, when I talk about void of colors in the background, there's an albino peacock just to with me. Cool. Thanks, everybody. I love that. One thing to notice here is that Charles and Gabrielle meet in a mental hospital, which mirrors directly David and Sid. Yeah, and we even have David allude to that when he says it kind of runs in the family. So you know that his parents also met the same way that him and Sid have met. They're all very fragile and have gone through traumatic circumstances in their lives.
This is how they met. My parents. In a mental hospital.
Why is that funny?
No, I guess it just runs in the family.
Now, at this point of the episode, this is when we start to get, now, of all songs, they chose Captain Sensible's What. That's immediately all I'm thinking of. Okay, there's some heavy British tones in this episode. British themes throughout from this point on, and all I'm thinking of is Sir Patrick Stewart. I'm thinking Charles Xavier, he was born in New York. His mom's British, his dad's American. At the same time, he went to Oxford. So I'm assuming this is still all Charles stuff. For
a little bit of English influence, though.
A little bit. But Sensible's What, and notice also for the music videos, I found it a little ironic. There's a clock in one of them, and it's just, who's on that clock? It's Mickey Mouse.
Mickey Mouse.
A little ironic for, FX and everything going on there right now, especially with Noah Hawley. So this is pretty cool. Also, you had Rolling Stones' She's a Rainbow. Now, that is a direct callback to episode 1 where David meets Sid for the first time. She comes in colors everywhere. She goes and ironically, this is from the Rolling Stones album, Their Satanic Majesty's Request. Okay, well, Shadow King.
Now, throughout Charles and Gabrielle's stay in the hospital, we see kind of their romance unfold. More and more times they're hanging out together, spending time. She finally breaks from her catatonic state. It's unclear if there's a movement in time that does this, or if Charles just uses his mind to do so. He sat down with her, and it looked like he used some telepathy to kind of break through.
But it was the angry boy, I think, that switched everything around for her, so we don't know.
Right, so we don't really know. But they do share cherry pie, which is significant because we've seen Sid and David have cherry pie in Clockworks back in season 1.
Who also likes cherry pie, though?
Cherry pie!
Then they had a back and forth about tomato versus apple. And initially, I actually looked this up. Initially, people were scared to eat tomatoes way back in the day, in the 1700s, because they considered them poison apples. They actually, visually looking at them, thought it was an apple. Some people, they would bite into it and then be scared to eat it. And actually, historically, the way that tomatoes, this is crazy, Greg, the way that tomatoes were served on the plates they were served on, the acidity in the tomato would actually lead to lead poisoning for those that ate them because they used a certain type of pewter plate. So that's why they become that's why they became poison apples. People would actually die from lead poisoning. It wasn't the actual tomato killing you, it was the combination of the plate you're using and the tomato that you're eating on top of it.
Yum.
The more you know, man.
You see, the more you read, the more you know. The better you do in school, the better you do in life. That's a promise.
Now this is when I thought about the ethics of using your powers, you know. Charles Xavier kind of has a moral code where he doesn't want to use it, and he wants to respect someone's privacy. But he also kind of forces his way out of the mental hospital with Gabrielle.
Love. Things you'll do for love.
Things you'll do for love, right? But like, is she really ready to leave? Is she healthy? Can she? She's very fragile at this point. So it's kind of doing a detriment to her, I believe, by, you know, forcing their way out of there and creating, and he can, like, you know, with a snap of a finger, get them into a dream home and away from all this. Also, it diverges from the comics. In the comics, they have a little affair. Their relationship fizzles out. She conceives of a child, but they don't go start a family. They don't go off.
Charles
and start a
doesn't
family.
know. Yeah, Charles does not know.
They don't go off and start a family together. It's not like happily ever after, and they go live in a mansion and raise a kid together.
No.
She gets pregnant. He doesn't find out about the child until like when Legion David Haller is as a teenager and comes back and she needs Professor X's help in order to kind of
he's already a world destroyer at this point.
He's already a world destroyer.
There.
Yeah.
Interesting to figure out where they're going to go from here and how they do have their split, whether or not it's just something with Gabrielle, whether her mind's gone at this point and that's where he decides, I'm going to build the X-Men and give up this child.
Right.
We'll see.
Because we did see the flashback of, you know, of the wheelchair when he's in the wheelchair, and then David's being given to a foster home, and basically for his own safety, because they know that something else is basically chasing him down. The Shadow King is looking for him. Little do they know is that he's already inside of him, and that no matter where he goes, that he is basically already infected, and he's already been kind of taken over by the Shadow King. So Charles, at some point, we can assume that Charles and Gabrielle, they have you know, a falling out over what this traumatic experience that happened between them and their child. Now, we both agree that that was not the X-Mansion.
Nope, not the X-Mansion.
That's like the house that's the starter home. And then he actually moved into the X-Mansion years later. That is called the Stimson House, and it's actually in downtown LA. If any of you guys want to go stop by and take a photo of it. It's actually been used in a handful of other TV shows and movies. I think more recently in Mad Men. It was used in a few seasons of Mad Men.
Mama! The tremble. He's here! The devil!
Now back to Gabrielle and the haunting of the Shadow King, or he's in the background. He's in the house at this point, and we see a little TV screen with a little bedtime is here kind of moment. And now that guy, this whole thing is very similar to what we saw in the first episode of this season with Switch and her dad. Doubtful, but I'm just gonna throw that out there. Is this Switch's dad, or are we just looking at something that's very similar to what's going on here?
I mean, who knows? Possible that because Switch has powers of time travel that someone else in her family does, or is aware of how to time travel. It was interesting to me that David, his powers aren't at the same level when he is time traveling.
we saw him get a little bit, he was screaming out to her, and we could see it played out through the television as he was trying to reach out to her and let her know the Shadow King's right there.
And then eventually we do see his almost a forced projection, let's call it, of himself near
through
the crib,
TV too.
near the crib later on, when she gets scared because she sees a physical representation of a 30-plus-year-old baby David.
The thing about that, though, is if it were just him, it might have been okay, but there's someone else overlaid on top of him. And it looks like it could be the monster form of the Shadow King. That's what I see. It also looks like an old David, too, so I can't really tell what that is. Just
Regardless,
yet.
it would scare the hell out of you.
You're feigning. Yeah. That's it.
Now, at this point, we get word that Charles has faced off with the Shadow King in Morocco in the astral plane, and that he basically accomplished his mission.
He's on his way home.
And he's on his way home. The problem is that he's going to be a little bit too late. This was a pretty awesome scene of how the Shadow King basically is making Gabrielle just go crazy in that house all alone by herself. There's no doors to get out of her own room. All she hears is David crying in the room next door.
You get some body horror as the little baby. You can't. She keeps turning it around. I loved
so
it.
Trippy.
And then her scream, and then you get the quick little Shadow King's coming out kind of vibe. You get is he taking over the entire place? Has he infiltrated her mind?
Right.
But that said, I loved all of it, especially the very end where you got the glasses.
Yeah, through the wall.
Coming out through the wall.
Coming out through the wall.
Yeah, that. Perfect.
Please!
So Gabrielle passes out after seeing that projection of David, and something we would assume that would probably trigger some type of catatonic relapse.
I'm assuming that she's probably back into her old catatonic state, and this is what leads to Charles possibly getting rid of David. Or not getting rid of. He has to leave and go fight the Shadow King or figure out what's going on.
Right. At some point, we can assume that Charles finds out that the Shadow King is not completely gone, and that for the safety of his own family, and specifically his child, that he has to give him up for adoption, basically. Now, the unfortunate thing is that, while Charles is attending to Gabrielle on the floor, it's the moment when the Shadow King initially creeps into David, and then we got that really cool shot of Farouk in a room with just David on his lap, and my beautiful boy. It was just a really cool representation of him taking control of David, the origin of how it all happened.
And David's giving Switch a little bit of a lost moment where we have to go back, we gotta do it again.
We have to go back!
Which is what I'm assuming they're going to do. He's going to try this again and reach out to his dad.
Definitely.
I doubt any good's going to come from this.
He can't give up that quickly, but remember, there are rules to time travel. We have to remember this because, she's losing teeth, Greg, and dentist bills add up. You can't go back, you can't go too far back in time. You gotta be deliberate when who you're planning to see and what events you're trying to change.
Also, we have the demon.
It doesn't sound good if you time travel too much.
So what's going to happen next year? I want to know, how are they screwing with the timeline? They went back. They went way back. Did they change anything? Were they able to change anything? I doubt it. I don't think they were able to change anything this time around, because I feel like what happens, and what we talked about in the first episode is if you go back in the past, it's your future.
Right. Now, what we do know is that bad things tend to happen when you go back in the comics, specifically with the character of Legion. You guys might remember the Age of Apocalypse. Well, that was basically started by Legion. He went back in time to try to kill Magneto, but unfortunately, he accidentally kills his dad, Professor X.
And it changes everything and leads us to, the world of Apocalypse.
Yes. So, bad things tend to happen in the comics, and I can only imagine that bad things will happen in this show if David and Switch keep trying to go back to time. I would love to see Charles Xavier in present day come and try to help
You want to
his son.
see him roll in there with that wheelchair and try
And
to stop
I don't just want to see, a bald Professor X in a wheelchair. I actually think that the only way to fix this and save some sort of happy ending for David
Xavier has to step in.
is that Xavier has to step in and do something.
That would be cool. Again, we talked about this almost every other episode of, are the X-Men gonna bust through a door at any point here?
I don't think the X-Men are gonna bust
through the door. This seems like a storyline where, there's some things that could happen here, world-changing, world-shattering events that, the X-Men would have to come in. Someone would get a ping here, be like, hey, this stuff's going on with the Shadow King, Division 3, what's going on here? Can we, help out? And no, none of that yet, which is awesome. I love that we're on our own island here, but at some point, it feels like either this is all in David's head, which is a theory that we all have right now, that everything could be coming from David's head, just like in the comics.
Yep.
They could pull it that way, but I at the same time, I'm just going to be a little bit of a nerd here and say I don't want them to reveal that if that's the case. I really want something more like a Twin Peaks Return kind of ending.
Up to your interpretation.
Yes, completely up to interpretation of what's going on, who's the dreamer, and then I'm floating if that's the ending of this show.
You have powers to float? Well, that'll do it for us this week, guys. Let us know any predictions, theories, or questions you might have in the comments below. We love hearing from you guys.
And we will see you all back here next week. Bye-bye.
Chapter 23, right?
Yes.
Let's do it.
Ooh.